of January 4th, 2021. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, is recognized until 10 p.m. as the designee of the minority leader.
I thank the Speaker. I've been listening to my friend from Texas, gentleman from New York, and other speakers, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and I can't help but observe the reality of the Shelby County decision as it was offered by the United States Supreme Court's majority, authored by Chief Justice Roberts. Now, what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle failed to mention is the fact that the Voting Rights Act remains intact, the Voting Rights Act remains fully in effect. Its purpose to ensure and preserve the ability of Americans to vote remains fully the law of the land. The only question, or the core question, before the court back in 2012 or 2013, I think it was argued in 12, decided in 13, I think, was whether Section 5, the specific preclearance provision, was in fact constitutional. Now, the fact of the matter is, when this was reauthorized back in, I think, 2006, it was reauthorized based on a 50-year-old coverage formula. Now, my friend from Texas knows that. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle know that it was using a 50-year-old coverage formula. Now, people may want to just kind of sweep that aside and say that doesn't matter, but then go back and read the Supreme Court's opinion in 1966 on the first challenge on the Voting Rights Act and what the court was saying at the time. That when you set aside the fundamental role of the states in carrying out elections, when you set aside the 10th Amendment, as the 1965 Voting Rights Act was seeking to do, well, there has to be a particularly strong purpose. Well, what was that particularly strong purpose? Invidious discrimination of the kind of the Jim Crow South, of the poll taxes, of massive disparities in voting rates among populations in districts where those prohibitions existed. Fast forward 50 years through several iterations of the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, and in 2012, 2013, when this was being debated and when the court decided it, the court said, look, sorry, you can't apply 50-year-old data to uphold and reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. Now, I know that because I was a lawyer on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I pored over every one of those documents that came before us and read and reviewed them, sitting as a staffer on the Senate Judiciary Committee, where we knew full well what the data was showing us and what the data looked like. But here we are right now, and the American people are only hearing that part of the story, that we are somehow unwinding the Voting Rights Act. We have done no such thing. Out of enormous respect for my friend from Texas, despite the fact the way these hours normally work, I will yield briefly to the gentlelady from Texas.
The gentleman is always enormously courteous, and I will be brief. Since I was on the committee, you might have been in the staff, but I know in the House, for example, we had at least 100 hearings and 15,000 pages of testimony, and it was chaired at that time by Jim Sensenbrenner, a Republican, who was meticulous in making sure we had a record. So I'm not sure where the gentleman's getting his information from, and I'll just finish by simply saying the voter suppression laws that we are dealing with today is all engaged, responding to the big lie that there was not a legitimate election in 2020, and my good friend knows that President Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were elected in 2020, so we wonder the basis of these voter suppression laws. I thank the gentleman, and I will not take more of his time, and I'll yield back to him.
I appreciate the gentlelady, and let me just say, I think that this body would do a wonder for the American people if we could engage in this for hours, not seconds. And I think the gentlelady agrees that we should have this kind of debate and back and forth for the American people to see so that we could flush out our differences. Because there are things that we agree on and there are things that we disagree on. What I would respond to the gentlelady about the point of what occurred, poring over it as a staffer as I did, was that the members, including the chairman of the Judiciary Committee then, Sensenbrenner, as well as on the Senate side, and I won't speak for the House because I was on the Senate side, but I was in the room with Chairman Specter, and I was in the room with all of those that were in 2006 going through all of this, and I was in the room with about 15 Republicans who were sitting over there, each of whom said, it is unconstitutional, we can't really do this, but we dare not go down this political road. Okay, well, that is what that is. Fast forward, and for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to bemoan, quote, activist courts, unquote, well, welcome to the club. Welcome to the party of being concerned about activist courts. I would argue this is not activism, but fine. Let's have that debate about how much power we want to cede to the building over there across the street. Because when we're talking about activism, we can go way back on activism in terms of our views, in terms of Roe, in terms of Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and other areas in which the court has inserted itself into the public debate. But okay, here we are. The legislature acted, and the court said, whoa, whoa, you can't do that. And why did they do that? Applying the 10th Amendment, applying fundamentals of federalism, applying the fact that states have primacy over election laws. That's what the court did. And that's actually, if you believe in judicial review, subsequent to Marbury versus Madison, as I believe that my friend from Texas, who's now leaving the floor, that it does believe in, well, then that's what the court was doing. That's what they did. That's what the opinion says. When you read the opinion, it's just dripping with all of the things that you would expect it to be filled with in terms of deference to what occurred in 1965, what the Supreme Court said subsequent to that about why it was a particularly important time for Congress to step over the role of the states because of the nature of the invidious discrimination in Jim Crow South and other areas of the country. It wasn't just the South, by the way. There were counties all over the country. But when you looked at the data, and I pored over the data, we showed places, there were counties in Florida that were covered, counties in Florida that weren't covered, and you could see that the voting rates of black voters, Hispanic voters, other voters, that vast numbers of people were turning out and showing up to vote, those numbers were even higher in some of the covered jurisdictions. So you had no reason or basis to cover one county versus another in the state of Florida. But I would challenge all of my colleagues, other side of the aisle, go open up those views, go look in and look at the data, look at the tables, and what you will find is that there was significant numbers of counties and states that were then at that time covered by the Voting Rights Act that had better turnout rates, better participation rates than those that were uncovered, which left the court looking at the law and said, well, hold on a second. The whole reason that the court upheld the law was because there was a unique circumstance where there was massive disparities because of very direct actions by those states. I just want the American people to know that. Because that's what's being said right now is that suddenly if I say, oh, we might want voter ID. Now, why might we want voter ID? Just to assure that the one person who's voting and one person, one vote is actually the vote. I say I want voter ID. Maybe that's because I've witnessed reasons why that's so. Somehow that's voter suppression. See, that's what's so entirely frustrating is that you come forward and you say, hey, I think that there's a good reason for this, that in my mind, I see very clearly as being important for the integrity of the election. Let's not get wrapped around in the 2016 or 2020 election cycles. I've said a lot on the floor of the House in various times about that matter, or those matters. Let's just actually focus on voter integrity, election integrity, and wanting to make sure that the people who vote know that their vote is going to count fully, and that you're not going to have someone voting with your ID. We know for sure that there are individuals who come to the United States and use the identifications of others, of Americans. We know that for sure. That's the fact. We know that we end up with multiple people voting. We end up with all sorts of different possible and potential fraudulent activity. For example, the New York Times in 2012, quote, yet votes cast by mail are less likely to be counted, more likely to be compromised, and more likely to be contested than those cast in a voting booth. That's the New York Times, that bastion of right-wing conspiracy. We know that the Carter-Baker Commission, Jimmy Carter, known right-wing conspirator from Georgia, and James Baker, again, not really known to be, a right-wing activist, quote, in their report, absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud. Well, that's just data. It's just analyzing it. It's just fact. So then you go through and you go other examples of known fraud. 2016, 83 registered voters in San Pedro, California received absentee ballots at the same small two-bedroom apartment. 2018 North Carolina congressional race, a Republican operative, L. McCrae Dowles Jr., had allegedly requested more than 1,200 absentee ballots on voters' behalf and then collected the ballots from voters' homes when they were mailed out. That was a Republican operative. I mean, equal opportunity presenter of the facts here of how fraud can occur. I can go through item after item. In 2017, an investigation of a Dallas City Council election found 700 fraudulent mail-in ballots signed by the same witness using a fake name. There's other voter fraud in Texas. Since 2005, the Office of Attorney General successfully prosecuted 534 instances of fraud against 155 individuals, et cetera, et cetera. I can go through county by county. In Medina County, Texas, 4 people, including an elected justice of the peace, were charged in February with 150 counts of election fraud. The charges included ballot harvesting and illegal voting. I can go example by example. Now, were all of those examples I just gave enough to turn an election? Texas went, I don't know. Right? That's the point. We would like to know wherever that truth may lead, in whatever state, in whatever county, wherever that takes us. But those are the facts. And so when somebody comes forward and says, hey, I think we ought to have voter ID. I think we ought to have voter ID or a way to attach an individual to a mail-in ballot. Suddenly that's voter suppression, right? So suddenly Major League Baseball walks in and says, I got an idea. Let's pull out the All-Star game from Atlanta, Georgia, where we could celebrate Hank Aaron, which is a 50% black city, and let's go move it over to Colorado and to Denver, which is a 10% black city, and let's pat ourselves on the back for being so exceptionally in tune with what's going on in the world. Let's move the All-Star game to Colorado. Why? The laws that were put on the books in Georgia this year that were being voted on in Georgia would basically make parity with what Colorado already has on the books. I mean, this is the kind of debate we want to be able to have. Can we just all agree and let's get a whiteboard up and put the facts up of what these things are, what these bills are, what these laws are, and then at least be debating from the same sheet of music? I'm going to have a few more things to say. I know I have some colleagues here that I want to be mindful of their time. My floor time, I digressed there a little bit because I was hearing my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. But election integrity is so critically important right now, and I've got colleagues from Texas who are completely abandoning their duty. I should say state legislature colleagues, to be clear, who are abandoning their duty to represent their constituents in the state of Texas in the legislature and have a full-throated debate about SB 1 and HB 3, the current bills in the legislative session, the special sessions in Texas, and have come to D.C. They're not doing their job. Look, man, I generally want to flee D.C. to go back to Texas. It's rare that I'd be saying I want to flee Texas to come to D.C. But these Democratic members of the Texas legislature have fled Austin to skip out on working in the Texas legislative session, have an open debate, and they're coming to D.C. to sit down with the vice president to go push and promote H.R. 1 or other bills to say we need to federalize elections instead of actually doing their job. Which brings me to my point. And I'll say a few things here and then I'll recognize my colleagues. At some point, we have to decide, what is it that is actually sacred about what we are doing here as a nation and as a body. Our borders right now are wide open, opioids skyrocketing, massive numbers across the border. I'll get into some of these details in a minute. We do it. I've done it before. We've got schools that are teaching so-called anti-racism. I walked through the Austin airport today and saw the book by Ibram Kendi, the anti-racism book. Can't remember the title. I saw it sitting there in the bookstore, the book people, I didn't see a whole lot of conservative books in there, but I saw that book sitting there in the front. On page 19 of that book, he writes, quote, "If racial discrimination is defined as treating, considering, or making a distinction in favor or against an individual based on that person's race, then racial discrimination is not inherently racist. The defining question is whether the discrimination is creating equity or inequity, and if discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist." Interesting definition of discrimination. Not sure that fits within the Civil Rights Acts, but I'll leave that for another discussion. But what I'm saying is we are heightening the level to which every single aspect of our lives is taken through a political lens. Every single thing. I'm asking my staff to look at every hearing that this body has had since the beginning of January and tell me what percentage of the hearings has had a focus or something to do on race or on sexual orientation or an issue in that type of framework. I guarantee you, I don't have to count them, that number is going to be massively high. I'll just go ahead and stipulate right now without having done any counting. The percentage of hearings that this body has held, the percentage of the hearings that is focused on race or on LGBTQ issues, sexual orientation, those issues will be extraordinarily high as a percentage. Okay, so the majority believes that's where our focus should be. While we just spent $6 trillion, while inflation is running through the roof, while small businesses can't hire people, and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle know this, because assuredly they've got small businesses in their district, or they go to the restaurants, or they go to the places like I've gone to, and they can't hire people because we're paying people more not to work than to work. So we have a principal focus on race-related issues, a complete abandonment of the responsibility of this body to secure the border of the United States. It's wide open. Opioids running amok, cartels own it, people pouring across it to their detriment and ours, ranchers getting overrun in Texas. And now today, just yesterday, or I don't know, last few days, the Senate Armed Services Committee votes overwhelmingly to draft our daughters. Heck, we had 8 Republicans of the 13 vote for that nonsense. To draft our daughters. Like, who are we? A genuine question. Who are we as a people, as a country? Like, where are the sacred boundaries of being able to decide how to live and to recognize truths? That man is man, that woman is woman, and that I, as a father, do not want to have my daughter get drafted. And you say, well, what about, I think, draft your son? Use the power of the government to draft the son. We can have a debate about ending the draft. Everyone comes back and says, well, don't worry, there's not going to be a draft. There hasn't been a draft in 50 years. So don't worry about it. What do you mean don't worry about it? When my daughter turns 18 in 8 years and she has to go sign a piece of paper to register, I shouldn't be worried about my daughter getting drafted and go get sent to a foxhole in Afghanistan or Iraq or somewhere else? What do you mean don't worry about that? Yet that's precisely what this body is doing. The Senate Armed Services Committee voted on it. The House already has that language. Let me be perfectly clear. I will not be honoring whatever law says is drafting my daughter. And that is the fundamental problem. The rule of law depends on it being rooted in any basic understanding of who we are as a people, where we come from, what our values are, and then actually being able to get the consent of the governed in a way that actually connects with the governed. It doesn't just come on down from on high from a Senate Armed Services Committee that votes, by the way, behind closed doors, not in public viewing. And by the way, none of them will go out and enforce this garbage. But no, somebody one day will show up and hand a form to my daughter and say, I'm sorry, ma'am, you're going to have to register for the draft. And I'm going to be sitting there as a dad, and I can promise you my wife is a little more fired up about this than I am. My wife is going to be sitting there saying, over my dead dang body. Now, this is what we do when we rip apart our society, when we forget where those sacred boundaries are, about what the role of this institution is or how we're supposed to govern. I'm going to pause for a few moments. I know that I think that both of my colleagues who are here want to speak to the issues that we're seeing unfold in Cuba, maybe a few other matters of importance to them, and I certainly appreciate their time. I think they share some of the sentiments that I'm sharing. But I would like to defer to my friend from Texas for 3 minutes, and then we can yield some more time. Does that work for my friend from Texas?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having a special order on freedom, on liberty, on constitutionalism, our God-given rights. Thank you for what you've said there, Brother Chip. Madam Speaker, I'm here tonight to highlight and amplify the miraculous events that have happened less than 100 miles from U.S. soil on the island of Cuba. News that sadly we haven't heard nearly enough about. After more than 60 years of oppression, injustice, and fear under a communist party that enjoys opulent privileges while others struggle just to survive. Cubans took to the streets shouting liberty, down with communism. And this wasn't just in Havana and the big cities. Renewed calls for freedom were heard all across small villages and towns in the Cuban countryside. These brave protesters, many of them young people, they knew their appeals would be met with violence. They understood that they would be putting themselves and their families at grave risk. They knew they would be labeled enemies of the state, enemies of the revolution, and they would be arrested or potentially even murdered. Today, I'd like to let each of my liberty-loving Cuban brothers and sisters out there know we hear you. I commend your outstanding and astounding courage, your thirst for freedom, and your desire for true justice in Cuba. We as Americans have a moral responsibility to support these protests of Cuba's cruel communist regime. How can we continue to be the shining city upon a hill, as President Reagan once eloquently said, if we do not help those that are seeking the same divine right that our ancestors fought and died for in the revolution, the same rights that our Heavenly Father intended for all people? I think it's time for the reign of dictatorship and terror to come to an end, and for freedom and for liberty to take their rightful place. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Texas, my friend, and I'm going to yield to the gentleman from California here in a second. And I would just ask one question to the gentleman from Texas, and I'll repeat that question to my friend from California. And I share your enthusiasm and your commitment to wanting to help the people of Cuba and who are seeking freedom and obviously been living under the thumb of tyranny for far too long. I was Chief of Staff Senator Ted Cruz. His father is a dear friend, and he knew all too well what life was like under that murderish regime. Our friend and our colleague, Alex Mooney, his wonderful mother, similarly at the same rough time frame, was subjected to the horrors of Cuba in that time in the late 50s, early 60s, and then it came to the United States. But I would ask my friend that as we watch these individuals from Cuba seeking freedom, and God bless them and we need to support them, and or seeking to come to the United States seeking freedom, do you believe that our country is itself upholding and adhering to the ideals that they are seeking?
My friend, at this time, I cannot answer in the affirmative. I think our country is under grave attack. our liberties and our freedoms, our constitutional rights, the Bill of Rights, the very, very reasons that Samuel Adams and Dr. Joseph Warren and all of those founders, John Hancock, that started the movement that culminated in the Revolutionary War and got us out from under the yoke of Great Britain. And I will say this, what we're seeing today is, quite frankly, a startling, unbelievable change of events that I never thought that I would see in my entire lifetime, of the assault on our God-given rights that we're seeing today. And what you just said about drafting our daughters and what you just mentioned, and listening to our friends across the aisle over there talking about the unfairness of the racism that is incumbent and inherently in our election processes. And what their solution would be, an absolute violation of the U.S. Constitution. And I think it goes without saying that if you have to show an ID to get into the White House, or to get a loan, or to do anything really of any kind of nature as far as that's concerned, that we have to have the ability to ask for a photo ID to ascertain whether you are indeed that person that you are actually professing to be when you come in and cast that vote. So we hear a lot of talk, but I'll tell you, it's just talk. When we talk about freedom and liberties, we have to follow that Constitution and God's law. That's what it has to be.
I thank my friend from Texas, and so I'll yield to my friend from California here just in a second. But I couldn't agree more with respect to the current situation we find ourselves in our country, in a country where we're now talking about vaccine passports, where we're talking about diving into the private affairs of American citizens in the alleged name of health and the welfare of the people. We're forgetting that fundamental core liberty of being free from government coercion, right? I mean, when you go look at the Constitution, you know, when we talk about the President of the United States talking about going door to door, and I know it might have been a rhetorical statement, but you never really know. But when the Constitution contemplates going door to door, it does so only in a couple of contexts: the census, and then protecting individuals against it by, in the Third Amendment, preventing the quartering of troops in the homes of the American people, by preventing, through the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable search and seizure, right? That was what was on the minds of the founders. That was why the Constitution was structured the way it was structured. It wasn't to empower government in the name of something supposedly greater, in the, quote, common good. How many hundreds of millions of people in this world have been slaughtered in the name of the common good? How many? Let's ask the people of Cuba. Let's ask the people of Cuba, seeking freedom, seeking to either come to the United States or have the kind of freedom that they believe exists in the United States and have that in Cuba, whether we should be empowering government supposedly in the name of the good or the common good of the people. Our Constitution exists to protect and preserve liberty. That's what it exists for. That's what this country was founded upon: a belief in the Almighty and a belief in liberty. And we are tearing that apart by the thread. Every single day, we are tearing that apart by the thread. Even as people today, right now, want to have a business and be able to employ people, they can't, because they're told by some bright-eyed leftist, don't worry, just pay them more money, without any concept of what that does to a bottom line, what that does to an income statement. Being able to actually raise money, risk capital, put their name on the line, borrow, and then hire people to engage in the business of their dream. Maybe they inherited from their family, their parents, their great-grandparents. And what do? We just say, don't worry about it, pay them $15 an hour. Like there's some magic fairy dust that tells people what the wage ought to be. And we destroy businesses in the name of being nice to people. And you know what it does? limits the numbers of jobs, drives up the prices of goods, causes people not to have jobs, causes people not to be able to get the job and then be able to afford whatever it is they want to buy. All because somebody said, oh, gee, I've got a magic number, $15 an hour. Why not 20? Why not 50? I mean, if we're going to be all generous, hell, just make it $1,000 an hour. Oh, no, Chip, that's just crazy talk. Child tax credits. Why stop at $300? Modern monetary theory, just spend whatever you want to. Why not make it $30,000? Man, then everybody be doing great. My colleagues don't ever want to actually sit down and actually put pen to paper and figure out, well, what in the heck can we actually afford as a country? And what are we doing to the dignity of work? What are we doing to the American family? And what are we doing to freedom and the ability of the individual to prosper according to his or her hard work and according to what he or she wants to accomplish through their faith and what they want to put in the toil they want to put into their life? And we're ripping that apart. We're ripping it apart in the name of compassion. Just like we're ripping apart the lives of migrants in the name of compassion who are getting absolutely decimated by cartels. And we do it and we say, oh, look at us, how nice we are. When the little 7-year-old girl is sold into the sex trafficking trade because we've put them in the hands of violent cartels along the border of Texas. Does anybody care about the numbers? Has anybody looked at what's actually happening down at the border? I know, there he goes again. There goes that crazy Chip Roy talking about the border again. Well, talk to my constituents. Talk to the people of Texas who are getting absolutely crushed. The numbers are astounding. And we're not just talking about people and the problems that we're having with ranchers, and we're talking about the sex and human trafficking trade. Right here we see the encounters by month. We've never seen anything like this. When Jay Johnson headed up the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama, he said 1,000 a month was a crisis. Y'all, I was just looking at the numbers. We had a few thousand in a week just last week in the McAllen sector. 20,000. We had 20,000 a week. I'm sorry, in a day. I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. We had a few thousand in a day in the Laredo sector. A few thousand a day in the McAllen sector. We've had, I think, it's from memory, 70 Border Patrol agents get COVID in the last month. We had 20 in Laredo. All of this is happening in real time. All while the administration talks about unwinding Title 42 and not worrying about what's happening at our southern border while telling us and preaching to us about vaccine passports. Oh, no, you better go mask up again. Fentanyl. Right down here, fentanyl. 2021 versus 2020 fentanyl numbers. We are bringing in, here's 1,000 pounds of fentanyl in a month. 1,000 pounds of fentanyl in a month. That's enough to kill millions of people. But that's happening right now, but nobody seems to care on the other side of the aisle. Say, oh, don't worry, it's just fentanyl. No problem to see here. But just say that to my constituent, an Austinite who died with a Valium laced with fentanyl recently. And this is happening across the country. We're now at 92,000 or so opioid deaths in this country. I'll come back to that in a minute because I want to yield to my friend from California, but that's what we're facing. And with that, I would yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, and happy to yield more if he needs it.
Well, I appreciate my colleague, both the colleagues from Texas here. I appreciate the time and the spirited debate here. You know, I hadn't intended to talk about the draft there, but Mr. Roy was bringing that up very vigorously, and I have to agree 100% that our volunteer military has worked pretty well for us for approximately, I think, 40 years. And so what is it that would have anybody even institute the idea of a draft for men or women, incredibly, at this point? Is it because our numbers are down? Is it because we're not getting the people in? Or is it somehow some kind of equity? I'm not sure what the mindset is. But if you want to inspire people to be part of our military, why don't you make it inspiring? Instead of a bastion of political correctness and the woke racism conversations happen everywhere else, where even our member, the Joint Chiefs of Staff member, he's bringing it up and bringing this literature out that is supposed to make people feel bad about serving as brothers in arms in the military, because of their race. If you want to inspire people to be part of it, don't make them feel bad about joining it. And therefore, you don't even have to talk about draft, because you can get folks that want as an opportunity, whether it's their dedication completely to serving their country, or they see some opportunities there with the education that can be offered through the programs in the military. Whatever the combination is, you inspire people to be part of it, just as if you're selling a product anywhere else on the market, in the free market in this country. Why in the world would we do this political correctness, this continued race conversation that is driving people away? I don't understand.
Would the gentleman yield for just one second? Would it surprise the gentleman to learn that I share your concern about the state of the United States military, given the politically correct nature of the current leadership? I just met with a bunch of parents of the individuals that I have nominated to go to the academies, and these parents are beside themselves. They're saying, please, can you stop this? It's going to endanger my kids who are going to go serve their country at the academies, because they hear the facts. They see that the U.S. Special Forces hired their first chief diversity officer, that the Department of Defense just hired a chief diversity officer, that a Space Force guardian was fired for saying, quote, the diversity, inclusion, and equity industry and the training we are receiving in the military is rooted in critical race theory, which is rooted in Marxism, and was fired. And this isn't just embarrassing and un-American, it's making us weak. Our diplomats are apologizing to the Chinese Communist Party for racism when Beijing is running concentration camps. This is the reality of what we're doing to our military, where we're running ads talking about LGBTQ issues instead of actually just recruiting warriors to go defend the United States of America. I yield to the gentleman.
It's a pretty clear, defined mission what our military is supposed to be doing in protecting our shores. And we've certainly strayed very far from that. And as I mentioned, it's not inspiring the best, the brightest, the toughest to come in, because I've had some of these conversations with the parents and some of the people already in the military. I heard a young man just the other day during the 4th of July, of all things. I said, what do you think of what's going on? And this young man is very, very gravely concerned, because by far there are a lot of great, great young people there that are standing up for their flag, for their country, and they're wondering what's going on with their leadership. And indeed, if we want to be at the point of the type of readiness that's even more acute than ever right now in this world with China, China's just waiting. China's probably over there laughing at us right now with what's going on under this administration and the priorities for our military. Russia is poised to continue to do more aggression in their zones over there, and let alone an unstable place like Iran and even North Korea. What is it they can do or be capable of doing? And now with this pullout of Afghanistan, what are we unleashing there? And so we got to return to a common sense approach that goes back to what the true military role and duty and mission is, and we're drifting far from it. So now, what I wanted to pick up on too, as far as when we're talking about our border, immigration in general, and this recent topic with Cuba. Okay, so what do we learn from 60 plus years of oppression under Castro and those that followed? Maybe everything wasn't beautiful under Batista back, 1959 or what have you, but they certainly, when they had that revolution then, I don't think the regular, normal, good people of Cuba bargained for what they've had at all for the last 60 years. And so, and the way this administration is handling it, almost basically ignoring it, looking at the people of Cuba who are holding our flag, not unlike in Hong Kong. It's very interesting. And that question you posed to my colleague, maybe you want to pose it again here, but when we're going in the direction of where Cuba is, where the Communist Chinese Party is going, we're holding up pictures of Che Guevara. Even in this chamber, we hear the type of sympathy towards the Castro era. Unbelievable to me. How has this been allowed to happen? Well, part of it, I guess, is the American public isn't paying enough attention. You need to demand more, demand better of who you're electing and compare this, contrast this with what hasn't worked around the world under communism for many decades. So with Cuba, you have a situation where this administration is ignoring those that are seeking asylum from a communist regime for years and years. And we have a lot of good Cuban people that have come to this country years ago. They even trickle in now. Colleagues that Mr. Roy had mentioned here, that some are in this chamber of Cuban descent. They love this country, and they see the opportunity here. That's why they cobbled together these boats and rafts, I like to say made basically out of milk cartons. They're coming towards us. We don't see people complaining about this country and its flag and desecrating its flag, cobbling together milk carton rafts and going towards Cuba and their amazing healthcare system and their amazing education system that we hear people on the other side of the aisle claiming to be the way to go. So what is it? What is asylum? When we're granting it to people coming up illegally from Central America, they're not seeking the true definition of asylum. They're seeking economic opportunity. Do I blame them? No, when they live in bad conditions down there, but they also see this giant green light at our border saying, come on across. Even though the laws on the books say no, we have people, hired to patrol the border. Instead, they're being focused more and directed more to be a welcome wagon at the border. What are we doing? Asylum is defined: the protection granted by a nation to someone who was left their native country as a political refugee. The people have been trying to, and some successfully escaping Cuba for 60 years, are the perfect definition of that. Those are the ones we should be looking at, and this administration should be looking at, is finding a way to help them. And those in Central America that are coming here for jobs, we have legislation to work in that direction to have a legal workforce come here, or those that are already here illegally, find a way to get to a legal status under our rules, under our laws. But no, this administration is leaving our border wide open, as is mentioned. The fentanyl, thousands of pounds? How far would that go? And where is it landing? And the stuff we do catch is significant, but the stuff that we're not catching up with at the border, where's that going? Where's it being stockpiled? When is that going to come out? That's extremely dangerous, extremely. So I like to think, those freedom fighters, whether it's Hong Kong and other places that are using our flag as a symbol of freedom and hope, and the one they want to emulate and get to, whether it's in their country or maybe even come here, and we're going in the other direction. It's unbelievable to me when we can't even have our Olympians respect our flag. We can't have our soccer team. When we can't have basically the recitation of the national anthem, singing the anthem or the recitation of our flag salute in our schools. One of the young men I talked about now in the military, really proud of that young man. I don't have authorization to say his first name is Grayson. What a great kid. He's going to be a real doer in our military. He fought to just have his flag salute done at his high school where it hadn't been done in 40 years and had to overcome a bureaucracy that said, oh, we don't know, it might offend somebody. Oh, we haven't asked all the teachers. We haven't asked all the school board. This young man took it upon himself to petition his fellow students to get this done. I said, if they don't get it done, I'll be right there with you at 8:30 in the morning. We'll do it out front of the school.
Amen.
Well, they got it done.
Amen.
And I'm so proud of him and what he's going to do. But there's many, many, many Americans like that all over this world, serving across the world, living here in this country, that believe in that as well, that take that pledge. That spontaneously, when at the baseball game, if they're not going to do the national anthem, they spontaneously start it themselves.
Yep.
Pretty amazing. At the NHL hockey playoff game in New York, those Islander fans stood up and joined in the one that was going on. And the singer, she actually stood down so she could feel that moment. Pretty amazing. This still exists in the hearts and minds of most Americans in this country. And we're not going to allow ourselves to be beaten down by political correctness, critical race theory, and all these other things that aren't really who we are or what is in the hearts of the vast majorities of these people, the people of this country. So when we're talking about our border, which is a sieve, which is a giant problem, it wasn't a problem nearly as much under President Trump, who was trying to solve the issue, but also work with those countries and help solve the issue within. Instead, it was just open season on all of us, on our taxpayers, our schools, our healthcare system, and even all the COVID business that has been manipulated to a degree that Americans really need to question how much longer they're going to have their freedoms, as was mentioned by Mr. Roy. Vaccine passports being forced upon us. You know, in California, they're talking about you can't work in the state as a state employee unless you get the vaccine, or perhaps you can get off the hook by getting a test every single week. Where's our liberties? If you're not concerned about your liberties and basic freedom, you better wake up right now, because you don't get them back once they've been taken. It's much more difficult to get them back than what our founders had laid down, and all those that have fought and are buried in Arlington that I drove by on the way in town today to preserve. We have a job as Americans. I wear this tie and suit, left my farm every week to be a part of it too, because, you know, we can't just sit still anymore. We all have to be part of this.
I thank the gentleman from California, and I appreciate the passion and the commitment to what you just shared, and with not just me and with my friend from Texas, but with the American people. I would ask the speaker how much time we have remaining.
The gentleman from Texas has 3 minutes remaining.
Wow. Well, I appreciate my colleagues coming down and joining. And I would only add this: as we sit here and we hear so much negativity about what's going on, the virus, for example, and vaccines. I hear nothing from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but you know how everybody's stonewalling and so forth. We have produced we have administered 188 million individuals with a vaccine in this country, 340 or so million doses, about 57% of the total population. About 80% of those over 65 have had 2 shots, 90% have had 1 shot. We are well above the vast majority of the world in terms of total numbers. As a percentage, we're a little bit behind, but it's because we're a large country. And so when you look at what we've actually accomplished, remember, it's our colleagues on the other side of the aisle who last year was saying, oh, this vaccine stuff, that's all fool's gold. And we know that's true, right? And we know that's what the vice president said, and a lot of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, don't touch the vaccine, that's crazy stuff. Well, now all of a sudden it's like, you better go get the vaccine. Run and get the vaccine. You have to get the vaccine. Get the vaccine. Okay. I'm telling my dad, polio survivor, 78 years old, go get the vaccine, Dad. But what if you have natural immunity? Should you go get the vaccine? What if you're a kid? Should you go get the vaccine? There are questions, and they're reasonable questions. And yet this government, in its infinite wisdom, the same infinite wisdom that shut down businesses, shut down schools, mandated masks, created all sorts of mental health issues, prohibited people from going to go get cancer screenings and take care of themselves and their families, forced elderly couples who have been married for 40 or 50 years not to be able to say goodbye when one of them was passing away, all in the name of the government taking care of us. In the infinite wisdom of the government, I should just go run down and say, oh, sure, let me go run down and go get the vaccine, when how much money has been given to the pharmaceutical companies? How many billions of dollars are they getting, and how much do they get for the boosters? By the way, it was my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who was going after the profitability of the pharmaceutical companies in an oversight hearing that I was in last year, 2 years ago. The bottom line here is, this country is a great country, filled with great people, doing great things every single day. And when this body and this government gets out of the way of the American people, they continue to do great things. And the greatness and the future of our country lies with them, with the people. And with that, I will yield back.
Pursuant to Section 11B of House Resolution 188, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate and noon for legislative